The weight of family expectations is a burden some shoulders are never meant to bear alone. For Samantha Martinez, the price of love had always been measured in dollars and duty. 34 years of being the responsible one had taught her that strength was both a gift and a curse, praised when convenient, exploited when necessary. But when her father's will delivered a final betrayal, Samantha found herself standing at a crossroads, continued to prop up a family that saw her as little more than a safety net, or finally break free and redefine what it meant to belong. As the storm of old wounds and new revelations gathered around her, Samantha would learn that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what you're given, it's what you refuse to accept. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Samantha Martinez stared at the framed family photo on her desk, her fingers tracing the glass over her 8-year-old face. Even then, the pattern was visible: Jason, front and center with their parents' hands on his shoulders, while she stood slightly apart, already learning to be self-sufficient. At 34, Samantha had built a successful career as a senior financial analyst in Chicago, earning six figures and living in a downtown condo that her parents had never bothered to visit. Her apartment was immaculate, every surface organized with the precision that had carried her through life. But beneath the polished exterior lay a woman who struggled to trust others, who controlled every detail because chaos felt like failure. "Sam, you coming to Mom's birthday?" Jason's voice crackled through her phone, casual as always. At 37, her older brother still had that easy confidence of someone who'd never truly faced consequences. "Of course," she replied, though part of her dreaded these family gatherings. They followed the same script. Jason would arrive late with some excuse. Their parents would fuss over him, and Samantha would handle the logistics: the cake, the gift, the cleanup. Growing up, she'd watched Jason receive praise for mediocrity while her achievements went unnoticed. When he brought home a C+ in algebra, their father would beam and suggest ice cream. When Samantha earned straight A's, she'd hear, "That's nice, honey," before the conversation shifted back to Jason's latest interest. The pattern had shaped her into someone who anticipated needs before they were expressed, who solved problems before they became crises. But it had also made her lonely, building walls around her heart that even she couldn't fully dismantle. The call came on a Tuesday night when Samantha was 16. Their father had suffered a massive heart attack at work, and their mother was too hysterical to make decisions. Jason, away at college, couldn't get home until the weekend. Samantha found herself in the ICU, signing forms and speaking with doctors while her mother sobbed in the waiting room. In those sterile hallways, she aged years and hours, learning that being capable meant carrying burdens others couldn't or wouldn't. When her father survived, the family dynamics shifted permanently. Samantha became the responsible one, the problem solver, the safety net. Her college acceptance letters to Cornell and Yale gathered dust as she chose a local university to stay close to home. "You're so strong," her mother would say, as if strength were a choice rather than a necessity. "Jason needs more support, you understand, don't you?" The financial support began innocuously. Her mother needed dental surgery, $8,000. The house required a new roof, $12,000. Each time, Samantha stepped in because she could, because she was doing so well, because Jason was still finding himself. But late at night, in her childhood bedroom, Samantha would stare at the ceiling and wonder what her life might have looked like if she'd been allowed to be the one who needed support, who could make mistakes without consequences, who could simply exist without constantly proving her worth. By her late 20s, Samantha had established herself professionally while Jason cycled through failed ventures. His restaurant lasted 8 months. His consulting business never gained traction. His real estate investment group collapsed spectacularly, leaving him with debt and excuses. Each failure was met with family sympathy and financial rescue. Each of Samantha's successes was acknowledged with a brief, "Good for you," before attention returned to Jason's latest crisis. "He's struggling with confidence," their mother would explain during their weekly phone calls. "Success comes so easily to you, Sam. You don't understand what it's like to fail." But Samantha did understand failure. She'd simply never been allowed to indulge in it. When her first serious relationship ended, she'd grieved alone while her parents worried about Jason's latest breakup. When she'd been passed over for a promotion, she'd worked harder instead of seeking comfort. The revelation about Jason's character assassination came through Eleanor, their cousin, during a family barbecue. "I always wondered why your parents thought you were so cold," Eleanor said, wine loosening her tongue. "Jason's been telling them for years that you only call when you need something, that you think you're better than everyone." The words hit Samantha like a physical blow. For 15 years, she'd been sending money, visiting regularly, and prioritizing family needs over her own desires. Meanwhile, Jason had been systematically poisoning their parents against her, ensuring his position as the favored child remained unchallenged. That night, Samantha sat in her car outside her parents' house, finally understanding why her efforts never felt appreciated. She wasn't fighting for recognition. She was fighting against a narrative Jason had been crafting since childhood. The call came at 3 a.m. on a Thursday. Their father had suffered a massive stroke and was being rushed to Northwestern Memorial. Samantha arrived at the hospital still in her pajamas, her mind automatically shifting into crisis mode. Jason appeared 6 hours later, claiming his phone had died and he'd been dealing with some business stuff. Their mother accepted his excuse with the same grace she'd always shown his shortcomings, while Samantha had already spoken with doctors, arranged for time off work, and begun coordinating care. Their father lingered for 3 days, conscious but unable to speak. During those final hours, as Samantha held his hand, he managed to whisper, "Always so capable." It wasn't the declaration of love she'd craved, but it was acknowledgement too little, too late. The funeral arrangements fell to Samantha. Naturally, she chose the casket, wrote the obituary, coordinated with the cemetery, and managed the reception. The bill totaled $15,000, which she paid without question. Jason promised to reimburse her once things settled down, a phrase that had become his signature deflection. At the service, family friends praised Jason's emotional eulogy while Samantha's practical arrangements went unnoticed. She stood at the graveside, watching dirt fall on her father's casket, and felt something inside her finally break not from grief, but from the realization that even in death, her father's love remained conditional. The lawyer's office smelled of leather and disappointment. Samantha sat beside her mother and Jason, expecting the usual division of assets she'd helped her parents plan years earlier. She'd even prepared to gift her portion to Jason if he needed it, another gesture of the selflessness that had defined her role in the family. "To my son, Jason, I leave my entire estate," the lawyer read, his voice carefully neutral. "This includes the family home, all financial accounts, and personal property." Samantha's name wasn't mentioned again, not for a token amount, not for sentimental items, not even for acknowledgement of her years of support. She sat frozen as the lawyer continued, watching Jason's face transform from surprise to satisfaction. "Your brother deserves it," her mother said afterward, her tone suggesting the matter was settled. "He needs the security more than you do." The words echoed in Samantha's mind as she drove home in a daze. 15 years of financial support, countless hours of caregiving, sacrificed opportunities all dismissed as if they'd never happened. She'd been erased from her father's final statement about what mattered to him. That night, she sat in her pristine apartment, surrounded by the success she'd built alone, and finally understood that she'd been playing a rigged game. No amount of achievement would ever earn her the unconditional love Jason received simply for existing. The first call came 3 weeks later. Jason needed help with the mortgage payment, $300 due immediately. The house, it turned out, wasn't the asset they'd believed. Their father had refinanced repeatedly to fund Jason's failed ventures, leaving a balance of $450,000 on a property worth $380,000. It's just temporary, Jason assured her, his voice carrying the same casual confidence he'd used to request money throughout their lives. I'm expecting some income from a consulting project. But Samantha had learned to read financial statements, and the picture they painted was devastating. Credit card debt totaled $65,000. There were unpaid medical bills, overdue property taxes, and a second mortgage she hadn't known existed. The revelation about their parents' retirement fund came through Brittany, Jason's girlfriend of 2 years. He's been gambling again, she confessed during a tearful phone call. The restaurant money, the house equity, it all went to the casino. He owes people. Sam, dangerous people. Samantha felt the final pieces click into place. Her father's gift to Jason wasn't generosity, it was desperation. They'd mortgaged their future to enable their son's addiction, leaving him with debts that would destroy him and a legacy of financial ruin. The irony was bitter. In trying to protect Jason from consequences, their parents had ensured he'd face the worst ones possible, and they'd expected Samantha to clean up the mess, as she always had. Dr. Rebecca Chen's office was nothing like Samantha had expected. Instead of the sterile, clinical environment she'd imagined, warm earth tones and soft lighting created a space that invited honesty. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on family dynamics and trauma recovery. Samantha had spent 3 sleepless nights researching therapists before choosing Dr. Chen. She'd never been to therapy before in her family. Seeking help was seen as weakness, another luxury that practical people couldn't afford. "Tell me what brought you here," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying genuine warmth. The story poured out in fragments: the will, the inheritance of debt, 15 years of financial support that had gone unacknowledged. But as Samantha spoke, she realized she was starting much earlier, with childhood memories of being the responsible one while Jason was coddled. "I keep thinking I should feel grateful," Samantha said, her hands twisting in her lap. "My parents gave me strength, independence, but it doesn't feel like a gift. It feels like a burden I never asked for." Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. "What you're describing is a classic family dynamic called the golden child and scapegoat pattern. The golden child, Jason can do no wrong and receives unconditional love. The scapegoat you is held to impossible standards, but also becomes the family's emotional and financial caretaker." The words hit Samantha like a physical blow. For the first time, she had language for her experience. She wasn't crazy or ungrateful. She was trapped in a pattern established before she could consent to it. "But I was successful," Samantha protested. "I did well in school, got a good job. How is that being a scapegoat?" "Success doesn't negate the dynamic," Dr. Chen explained gently. "Your achievements became another way for the family to justify their treatment. You were strong enough to handle disappointment, successful enough to provide support, independent enough not to need nurturing. Your competence became a weapon used against you." Over the following weeks, Samantha learned about enmeshment, codependency, and financial abuse within families. She discovered her situation wasn't unique, Dr. Chen had treated dozens of clients designated as family caretakers from childhood. Setting boundaries feels like betrayal because you've been conditioned to believe your worth depends on your usefulness, Dr. Chen explained during their fourth session. But boundaries aren't walls, they're gates. You decide what passes through. The homework assignments were both simple and terrifying. Practice saying no to small requests. Notice when guilt was being used as manipulation. Write down her own needs, something Samantha realized she'd never seriously considered. I don't even know what I want, she admitted. I've spent so long anticipating what everyone else needs that I've never asked myself what would make me happy. That's common for people in your situation, Dr. Chen assured her. You've been so focused on external validation that you've lost touch with your internal compass. The process was exhausting. Samantha found herself crying at unexpected moments in grocery stores, during work meetings. 34 years of suppressed emotions were finally surfacing. She started keeping a journal, documenting feelings without judgment. The entries revealed patterns she'd never noticed: how she automatically assumed responsibility for others' emotions, how she interpreted conflict as evidence of her failure. I realized something, she told Dr. Chen during their sixth session. I've never had a relationship where I wasn't the caretaker. Friends, boyfriends, family, I'm always the one solving problems. I don't know how to just exist without being useful. What would it feel like to be loved for who you are, rather than what you provide? Dr. Chen asked. The question left Samantha speechless. She'd never considered being valued simply for existing, not for her ability to fix things or provide support. The decision to refuse Jason's mortgage request felt revolutionary and terrifying. Dr. Chen helped her practice the conversation, preparing for guilt trips and manipulation. Remember, Dr. Chen said, you're not responsible for managing other people's emotions about your boundaries. Jason's anger, your mother's disappointment, those are their feelings to process, not yours to fix. When Jason called again, Samantha's hands shook as she delivered her prepared response. Jason, I've given this thought, and I won't be providing financial assistance anymore. You need to find other solutions. The silence stretched for 10 seconds before Jason exploded. Are you fucking serious? After everything Dad left me, you're going to let the family lose the house. The house has been refinanced multiple times to cover debts that weren't mine, Samantha replied, surprised by her steadiness. Dad's inheritance came with financial obligations that are now your responsibility. This is about the will, isn't it? Jason's voice turned calculating. You're punishing me because Dad didn't leave you anything. The accusation stung, but Dr. Chen's voice echoed in her mind. When someone accuses you of being selfish for setting boundaries, they're upset they can no longer use you. This isn't about punishment, Samantha said. It's about breaking an unhealthy pattern. You're a capable adult. Jason, the family lost the house when Dad mortgaged it to fund your gambling, she added sharply. Jason's voice turned cold. You're going to regret this. Family is all we have, and you're throwing it away over money. Don't come crying to me when you're old and alone. The threat triggered her deepest fear: abandonment, isolation. For a moment, panic rose, the urge to apologize and offer help. But she remembered Dr. Chen's words about emotional blackmail. I understand you're upset, Samantha said, but my decision stands. She hung up, hands shaking. The aftermath was brutal: waves of guilt, fear, and doubt. Had she destroyed her family over money? But underneath the panic was something else, a tiny seed of relief. For the first time in her adult life, she'd said no to family and meant it. She'd chosen her well-being over someone else's comfort. The campaign began immediately. Her phone rang constantly. Jason, her mother, relatives. Each caller delivered the same message: family comes first. How could she abandon them? During her next session, Samantha played some voicemails for Dr. Chen. What do you notice about these messages? Dr. Chen asked. They're all about what I should do, Samantha realized. No one's asking what Jason could do differently. It's all about my obligation to fix things. And how does that make you feel? Angry, Samantha said, surprising herself. I'm angry that I'm the only one expected to sacrifice. I'm angry that my success is seen as reason to take more from me. The anger felt dangerous and exhilarating. Dr. Chen helped her understand that anger could be informative, a signal that boundaries were being violated. What's underneath the anger? Dr. Chen asked. Hurt, Samantha said finally. I'm hurt that they see me as a resource rather than a person. I'm hurt that my worth is measured by my bank account. What would it mean to love yourself the way you've been loving them? Dr. Chen asked. The question stopped Samantha cold. She'd never considered applying the same care to herself that she'd given others. I don't know, she admitted. I've never tried. That's okay. Doctor, Chen said gently, we're going to learn together. Walking out of the office, Samantha felt something shifting, not dramatic transformation, but a subtle reorientation toward her own worth. The little girl seeking external validation was beginning to quiet, replaced by a woman learning to trust her own judgment. The phone calls would continue, the pressure would intensify, but for the first time, Samantha had tools to resist and permission to choose herself. Jason orchestrated the pressure campaign with the strategic precision of someone who had spent years manipulating family dynamics to his advantage. Within hours of Samantha's refusal, her phone began ringing with a carefully choreographed symphony of guilt and obligation. The first wave came from their elderly relatives. Aunt Margaret, their father's sister, called with tears in her voice. Samantha, dear, I just heard about the terrible situation. Your poor mother is beside herself. Surely you can't let the family home be lost. It's where your father grew up, where you children played. How can you put money before family? Uncle Robert followed with a more aggressive approach. I don't know what's gotten into you. Sam, your father always said you were the responsible one, but this is just selfish. Jason's struggling, and you're doing well. Family helps family, that's how we were raised. Each call followed the same script, and Samantha realized Jason had briefed them all with his version of events. In his narrative, she was the successful sister who had abandoned her struggling brother out of spite over the will. He conveniently omitted the 15 years of financial support, the gambling debts, or his systematic campaign to undermine her relationship with their parents. The second wave targeted her professional life. Jason called her office, claiming a family emergency required her immediate attention. When that failed to break her resolve, he contacted her boss directly, spinning a story about Samantha being overwhelmed by grief and making irrational decisions that were hurting the family. I'm concerned about my sister's mental state, he told her supervisor, his voice heavy with false concern. She's not thinking clearly since Dad's death. The family is worried about her judgment right now. Samantha had to schedule an uncomfortable meeting with HR to explain the situation and provide documentation of her brother's harassment. The professional embarrassment stung, but it also crystallized her understanding of how far Jason would go to maintain his position as the family victim. Her mother's calls were the most devastating, arriving at all hours with escalating emotional manipulation. I can't sleep, Samantha. I keep thinking about your father, about how disappointed he would be. He left everything to Jason because he knew you were strong enough to help. You're breaking his heart, even in death. The guilt was suffocating. Samantha found herself lying awake at 3 a.m., second guessing every decision. Maybe she was being too harsh. Maybe family really should come first. Maybe her father's will was a test of her character. And she was failing spectacularly. During one particularly brutal conversation, her mother played her trump card. I've been having chest pains. Sam, the stress of all this, I think I might be having heart problems like your father. But I can't afford to see a doctor now that we're losing the house. I guess I'll just have to hope for the best. The manipulation was so blatant, it took Samantha's breath away. Her mother had excellent health insurance through Medicare and supplemental coverage, but the threat of another family medical crisis, another opportunity for Samantha to prove her worth through financial sacrifice, was expertly deployed. Mom, you need to see a doctor if you're having chest pains, Samantha said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. But I won't be paying for it, and your health issues don't change my decision about the house. The silence that followed was arctic. I don't know who you've become, her mother whispered. This isn't the daughter I raised. Your father would be ashamed. But Samantha had found her father's journal, and his own words contradicted her mother's narrative, hidden in his desk drawer, between insurance papers and old tax returns, was a small leather notebook filled with his careful handwriting. March 15th, Samantha sent another check today, $5,000 for the roof repair. I should feel grateful, but I just feel guilty. She's sacrificing so much for us, and I keep asking for more. But Jason can't handle disappointment the way she can. He falls apart when things go wrong, and she just gets stronger. June 3rd, Jason's restaurant is failing. He needs $50,000 to keep it afloat. I know I should say no, but he was crying on the phone. Samantha would never cry to manipulate me. She's too proud. Sometimes I think we've made her too strong, too independent. She doesn't need us the way Jason does. October 12th. I'm changing the will tomorrow. I know it's unfair to Samantha, but she'll understand. She always understands. Jason can't survive on his own, and she's strong enough to handle disappointment. I'm counting on her strength one more time. December 8th, Samantha called to check on my blood pressure medication. She remembers everything, takes care of everything. I don't deserve her, but I need her to keep taking care of Jason after I'm gone. She's the only one who can save him from himself. Reading those entries, Samantha felt something fundamental break inside her, not from grief, but from the crushing realization that her father had weaponized her strength against her. He'd known exactly what he was doing when he excluded her from the will. He'd counted on her sense of duty, her inability to let family suffer, her conditioned response to put others' needs before her own. The journal revealed years of deliberate choice disguised as circumstance. Her father hadn't been blind to the family dynamics, he'd orchestrated them. He'd seen her sacrifices and decided they weren't enough. He'd observed Jason's failures and decided they deserved reward. The final entry, dated just a week before his stroke, was the most damning. Samantha will be angry about the will at first, but she'll come around. She always does. She'll take care of Jason because that's who she is, the strong one, the responsible one, the one who fixes everything. I'm sorry to burden her again, but I don't have a choice. Jason needs her, and she needs to be needed. That last line shattered something in Samantha's chest. Her father hadn't just used her strength. He'd convinced himself she enjoyed being used. He'd told himself that being the family's emotional and financial caretaker was her purpose, her identity, her deepest need. Sitting in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by the detritus of a life spent serving others, Samantha finally understood that she'd been fighting a rigged game. No amount of sacrifice would ever be enough because her role wasn't to be rewarded, it was to keep giving until there was nothing left. The pressure campaign continued for weeks. Family friends called with concerned voices, sharing stories about other families torn apart by money disputes. Former classmates reached out on social media, having heard troubling things about Samantha's treatment of her grieving family. Even her hairdresser mentioned that she'd heard Samantha was going through a difficult time and offered unsolicited advice about the importance of forgiveness. Jason's masterstroke came when he organized a family intervention, inviting every relative within driving distance to gather at their mother's apartment for what he called a healing conversation. Samantha arrived to find 12 people crammed into the small living room, all of them primed with Jason's version of events. "We're here because we love you," Aunt Margaret began, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "We're worried that grief has clouded your judgment. Your father would want the family to stay together, not be torn apart by money." One by one, they shared their concerns, their disappointment, their bewilderment at her sudden selfishness. Jason sat quietly in the corner, playing the role of the wounded brother too devastated to speak, occasionally wiping away tears that appeared on cue. But Samantha had spent weeks in therapy, learning to recognize manipulation tactics and trust her own perceptions. She listened to each speech with growing clarity, seeing the strings Jason was pulling, the narrative he'd constructed, the way he'd turned her entire extended family into weapons against her. When they finished their prepared remarks, Samantha stood up slowly, her purse clutched in her hands like armor. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her voice carrying a calm that surprised even her. "I understand you're concerned about me, but you've been given incomplete information." She pulled out the folder she'd brought bank statements, receipts, documentation of 15 years of financial support. "Jason has told you I'm abandoning the family over money. What he hasn't told you is that I've given $170,000 to this family over the past decade and a half. He hasn't told you about his gambling addiction or the fact that Dad mortgaged the house 4 times to cover Jason's debts." The room fell silent as she continued. "He hasn't told you that he's been lying to our parents about me for years, telling them I'm cold and selfish while I've been paying for everything from dental surgery to car repairs. And he certainly hasn't told you that the inheritance he received is actually $450,000 in debt." Jason's face went white, but Samantha wasn't finished. "I appreciate your concern, but I won't be manipulated into resuming my role as the family ATM. Jason is a grown man who needs to face the consequences of his choices, and all of you need to ask yourselves why you're more comfortable pressuring me to give money than asking him to get a job." She walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. "If you want to help Jason, offer him your guest rooms and job references, but don't ask me to set myself on fire to keep him warm. I'm done being the family sacrifice." The intervention had backfired spectacularly, but it had also served a purpose. Seeing her entire extended family weaponized against her had finally severed the last threads of obligation that bound her to their dysfunction. She was free not just from financial responsibility, but from the need to justify her choices to people who had never bothered to understand her situation. That night, Samantha sat in her apartment, surrounded by the silence she'd once feared but now welcomed. Her phone had stopped ringing. The pressure campaign had exhausted itself, and for the first time in her adult life, she belonged entirely to herself. The little girl who had spent 34 years seeking her family's approval had finally died, replaced by a woman who understood that some love came with too high a price, and that woman was ready to build a life based on her own values, not her family's expectations. The family meeting was Jason's idea, a last-ditch effort to break Samantha's resolve. They gathered in the living room where she'd spent countless childhood hours, the space now feeling smaller and shabbier than her memories. "I don't understand why you're being so cruel," her mother began, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. "Your brother is struggling, and you have the means to help." Jason leaned forward, his expression a mixture of desperation and anger. "If you don't help, I'm going to have to take legal action. You have a moral and legal obligation to support family." "Legal obligation?" Samantha's voice remained calm, though her heart raced. "Based on what law? Filial responsibility," Jason shot back, though his uncertainty was obvious. "Children have to support their parents' debts." Samantha had researched this possibility, knowing Jason would eventually resort to threats. "Filial responsibility laws don't apply here. And Dad's debts died with him. The house is your inheritance and your responsibility." "You're being selfish," her mother interjected. "After everything this family has done for you, what has this family done for me?" The question erupted from Samantha with 15 years of suppressed frustration. "I've given $178,000 over the past decade and a half. I stayed in Chicago instead of going to Yale. I've handled every crisis, every emergency, every inconvenience." She pulled out the folder she'd prepared, documents organized with the same precision she brought to her professional life. "Here's the dental surgery I paid for, the roof repair, the car repairs, Jason's restaurant investment, the medical bills. Every single payment, documented and receipted." Jason's face paled as she continued. "And here's what I discovered about the family finances. Dad took $300,000 from his retirement fund to invest in Jason's ventures. The house has been refinanced 4 times to cover gambling debts. You didn't inherit assets. Jason, you inherited the consequences of your choices." "That's not I never asked for," Jason stammered. But Samantha wasn't finished. "Eleanor told me about the lies you've been spreading. For years. You've told Mom and Dad that I'm cold, that I only call when I need something, that I think I'm better than everyone. You've systematically poisoned them against me while I've been supporting this family." The room fell silent except for her mother's quiet sobbing. Jason slumped in his chair, the fight draining out of him as his carefully constructed narrative crumbled. "I'm done," Samantha said, standing. "I'm done being the family ATM. I'm done being blamed for problems I didn't create. I'm done sacrificing my life for people who see me as a resource rather than a person." She walked toward the door, then turned back. "The house will be foreclosed within 60 days unless you find another solution. I suggest you start looking for jobs and apartments. All of you." The foreclosure notice appeared in the local paper 6 weeks later. Samantha read it over her morning coffee, feeling a complex mixture of sadness and relief. The family home would be auctioned, but she was no longer responsible for preventing it. Jason's desperate calls continued for another month before stopping abruptly. Through Eleanor, Samantha learned he'd moved in with Brittany and started working at a warehouse, his first steady job in years. The gambling debts remained, but he'd begun attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings. Her mother's transformation was more gradual. The woman who'd spent 40 years depending on others to solve her problems suddenly found herself alone in a one-bedroom apartment, learning to manage her own finances for the first time. "I never realized how much I relied on you," she admitted during their first conversation in 3 months. Her voice carried a humility Samantha had never heard before. "I thought I was protecting Jason, but I was just enabling him, and I was using you." Samantha had spent those months in therapy, working through decades of accumulated resentment and misplaced guilt. The panic attacks had been the worst part, her body finally releasing the stress she'd carried for so long. But gradually, she'd begun to feel lighter, as if she'd been holding her breath for years and could finally exhale. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening, exactly 1 year after their father's death. Samantha almost didn't answer when she saw her mother's number, but something made her pick up. "I wanted to apologize," her mother said without preamble, "not just for the will, but for everything, for making you the responsible one when you were just a child, for taking your strength for granted, for choosing Jason's comfort over your happiness." They met at a coffee shop near Samantha's office, neutral territory that felt safer than either of their homes. Her mother looked older, but also more present somehow, as if she'd finally stopped looking through Samantha to focus on Jason. "I've been seeing a counselor," her mother continued. "She helped me understand how we turned you into the family caretaker before you were old enough to consent. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't love, it was convenience." The conversation lasted 3 hours, covering years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding. Samantha didn't forgive everything. Some wounds were too deep for immediate healing, but she felt something shift between them, a possibility of relationship based on choice rather than obligation. Jason's apology came through a letter, his handwriting shaky but sincere. He'd been sober from gambling for 6 months and was working to pay down his debts. He didn't ask for forgiveness or financial help, just acknowledged the damage he'd caused and his commitment to change. Samantha kept the letter but didn't respond immediately. Some bridges took time to rebuild, and she was learning to move at her own pace rather than rushing to repair relationships that others had broken. 2 years after the will reading, Samantha stood in her new office, looking out at Lake Michigan through floor-to-ceiling windows. The promotion to CFO had come with challenges. She relished complex problems that had solutions, unlike the family dynamics she'd finally escaped. Her relationship with her mother had evolved into something healthier, built on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation. They had dinner once a month, conversations that focused on the present rather than relitigating the past. Her mother had started painting classes and taken her first solo vacation at 68, discovering independence she'd never known she wanted. Jason remained a work in progress. He'd kept his warehouse job for 18 months, the longest he'd held any position. His relationship with Brittany had survived his financial collapse, and they were planning a small wedding. He still struggled with the urge to gamble, but he'd learned to recognize the triggers and had a support system in place. The family dynamics weren't perfect, they probably never would be, but they were honest now, built on reality rather than the fantasy that had sustained them for decades. Samantha no longer felt responsible for everyone else's happiness, and the relief was profound. She'd started dating again, tentatively exploring relationships with men who saw her strength as attractive rather than exploitable. It was strange, learning to be vulnerable with someone who didn't expect her to solve their problems, but it was a strangeness she welcomed. Epilogue. The True Inheritance. On the third anniversary of her father's death, Samantha visited his grave alone. She'd brought a letter she'd written but would never send, words that had taken years to find. "I understand now why you did what you did," she said to the headstone. "You were afraid Jason couldn't survive without protection, and you knew I could survive anything. You were right about my strength, but wrong about what I deserved because of it." The letter contained forgiveness, but also boundaries. She'd learned the difference between understanding someone's choices and accepting them as justified. Her father had made decisions based on fear rather than love, and while she could forgive him, she wouldn't pretend those decisions hadn't caused lasting damage. A month later, Samantha spoke at a conference about financial abuse in families, sharing her story with an audience of therapists and social workers. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people approached her afterward, recognizing their own experiences in her words. "The hardest part," she told the audience, "was realizing that being strong didn't mean I had to carry everyone else's weight. True strength sometimes means letting people face the consequences of their choices, even when you love them. She'd started a support group for adults who'd been designated as family caretakers, people who'd learned too young that love was conditional on usefulness. The group met monthly in her office building's community room, a circle of chairs where people could speak truths they'd never been allowed to voice. The inheritance she'd received wasn't money or property, it was freedom. Freedom from the obligation to fix what others had broken. Freedom from the guilt of prioritizing her own needs. Freedom from the exhausting performance of being perpetually grateful for scraps of affection. Standing in her apartment that evening, Samantha looked at the family photo on her desk, the same one that had started this journey, but now she saw it differently. The little girl standing apart wasn't isolated, she was independent. She wasn't forgotten, she was self-sufficient. She wasn't unloved, she was strong enough to love herself. The true inheritance, she realized, was the life she'd built despite everything, not because of it, and that inheritance was worth more than any amount her father could have left her, because it was something no one could take away. In the end, being excluded from the will had been the greatest gift her father could have given her, the gift of discovering that she didn't need his approval to be worthy of love, including her own. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her mother, calling to share news about her painting class. As Samantha answered, she smiled, grateful for this new relationship they were building, one based on choice rather than obligation, respect rather than duty, love rather than fear. "Hi, Mom," she said, and for the first time in her life, the words carried no weight beyond themselves. As the Chicago skyline shimmered beyond her window, Samantha felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her, an unfamiliar luxury after years of turbulence. The ghosts of old obligations and expectations had begun to fade, replaced by a newfound freedom to choose her own path. She realized now that family isn't just about blood or duty, but about the courage to set boundaries and the strength to honor them. The inheritance she had truly received was not a house or a fortune, but the power to define her own worth. With each breath, Samantha stepped further into a life built on her own terms, not as the family fixer, but as a woman unafraid to claim her place in the world. And for the first time, she knew the only legacy that truly matters is the one you write for yourself.